The church smelled like white lilies and lies. I stood in the back pew in a suit that didn't fit anymore, watching the woman I had loved since I was 11 years old walk toward a man who would never know her the way I did. Not the scar on her collarbone from falling out of my treehouse, not the way she hummed off-key when she was nervous, not the sound she made when she was trying not to cry. The doors were closing. The music was swelling. And somewhere between the third pew and the altar, Maya Whitfield turned her head, found my eyes across 100 strangers, and mouthed 4 words that would break me open for the rest of my life. Don't let me go. This is the story of how I almost didn't. I hadn't seen Maya Whitfield in 8 years, and I told myself I was fine with that. I was lying, of course. I'd been lying to myself since the night she left, packing that lie carefully into a box marked closure and shoving it into the back of a closet I never opened. I built a career instead. I built a name, Ethan Cole, the architect who turned a dying stretch of the Riverside District into the most photographed skyline in the state. I built glass towers and steel bridges and award-winning museums, and not one of them ever felt like coming home the way her laugh used to. Then my father's old business partner called to tell me Robert Whitfield had died, and everything I'd buried came clawing back up through the dirt. I told myself I was going to the funeral for my father's sake, for the friendship between our families that had outlasted 3 decades and 1 spectacular financial collapse. I told myself I was not going because some reckless, starving part of me needed to see her face again. I have never been a good liar, especially to myself. She was standing at the edge of the cemetery when I arrived. Black dress, black gloves, dark hair pulled back the way she used to wear it when she wanted to look older than she was. 8 years had sharpened her. The girl I remembered had soft edges, quick smiles, scraped knees, a laugh that filled a room. This woman held herself like glass, like something that had already been broken once and repaired so carefully you'd never see the cracks unless you knew exactly where to look. I knew exactly where to look. I'd memorized every inch of her before I was old enough to understand what that meant. Ethan. My name in her mouth still did something violent to my chest. You came. Of course I came. I wanted to reach for her hand and stopped myself, because I didn't know anymore if I was allowed to. 8 years is a long time. 8 years is long enough to become strangers who used to share a heartbeat. I'm sorry about your dad. Something moved behind her eyes. Grief, yes, but underneath it, something sharper. Fear, maybe, or guilt. I filed it away the way I filed away every small inconsistency in a blueprint, the tiny fractures that meant a structure wasn't as sound as it looked. There's a lot you don't know, she said quietly, and before I could ask what she meant, a man's hand landed on the small of her back, proprietary and smooth, and she stepped away from me like she'd been caught doing something wrong. Maya, sweetheart, they're ready for you. The man was tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of handsome that had been polished rather than earned. Julian Ashford, I would learn later, heir to Ashford Capital, a name that made bankers straighten their ties. He looked at me the way men like him look at everyone, assessing my net worth before he'd even learned my name. And you are Ethan Cole. I'm an old friend of Maya's. Julian, Maya's fiancé. He said it like a door closing. His arms slid around her waist, and I watched her spine go rigid before she caught herself and softened into him. A performance so practiced I almost believed it. Almost. I had spent a childhood learning the difference between Maya's real smile and the one she used when she needed the world to stop asking questions. This was the second one. Fiancé, I repeated, and something in my chest that had been quietly, foolishly hoping finally, completely died. Congratulations. Thank you. Julian's smile was all white teeth and no warmth. We're getting married in 6 weeks. Small ceremony, given the circumstances. He glanced at the fresh grave like it was an inconvenience rather than a grief. Maya, darling, your mother's asking for you. She let him lead her away, and just before she turned, she looked back at me over her shoulder with an expression I couldn't name. Not quite an apology, not quite a plea, something raw and unfinished, like a sentence she wasn't allowed to end. I stood alone at the edge of that cemetery and made myself a promise I had no right to make. I was going to find out exactly what had put that fear in her eyes, even if it cost me everything I had left to lose. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. I definitely didn't expect to see her standing in the lobby of Cole and Associates 3 days later, soaked from the storm outside, mascara smudged, looking like she'd been crying in her car for 20 minutes before working up the courage to come inside. "I need somewhere to think," she said, before I could even say hello. "And you're the only person left who won't ask me 100 questions I can't answer." I should have asked questions anyway. Instead, I gave her my umbrella jacket, sat her down in my office with a coffee she didn't drink, and let the silence between us stretch until it felt like the safest place in the world. "Do you remember the treehouse?" she finally asked. "You mean the one you fell out of because you were trying to prove you could climb higher than me?" A real smile, finally, small but real, the one I remembered. "I broke my collarbone. You cried for 10 minutes and then made me swear not to tell your dad, because you didn't want him to say girls shouldn't climb trees. He would have said it too." Her smile faded as fast as it came, grief pulling it back under. "He said a lot of things toward the end that I wish I could unhear." "Maya." I leaned forward, close enough to see the exhaustion carved under her eyes, the particular kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from carrying something too heavy for too long. "What happened to you? Where did you go? One day you were here and then you just vanished. No calls, no letters." 8 years, Maya. Her hands wrapped tighter around the coffee cup, and for a moment I thought she might actually tell me. Her lips parted, her eyes filled, and then, like a door slamming shut on a room I wasn't allowed into, she straightened her spine and said, "It doesn't matter now. I'm getting married. I have a life. I shouldn't have come here. But you did." "I did." She stood, gathering the jacket around her shoulders like armor. "Because you're the only person who ever made me feel like I didn't have to explain myself to be understood. And I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm sorry for 8 years of silence, and I'm sorry for showing up in your office like I have any right to your comfort. I don't. Not anymore. You have every right." My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "You've always had every right." She stopped at the door, hand on the frame, back to me, like she couldn't bear to watch her own next words land. "Julian's family saved mine. Financially. When my father's business collapsed, when the medical bills for my mother started coming in, Julian's family were the only ones willing to help. There are debts, Ethan. There are debts that don't get erased just because I want them to. So you're marrying him to pay off a debt." "I'm marrying him because it's the right thing to do." But her voice cracked on right, and I heard, underneath it, the word she wasn't saying. "Because I have no choice." She left before I could stop her. I stood at my window and watched her get into a car that wasn't hers. A driver holding the door, Julian's initials stitched into the leather seats. And I understood with a cold, sinking certainty that the woman I had loved my entire life was being sold to settle a debt, dressed up in the language of love so no one, least of all her, would have to call it what it was. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark of my apartment with 8 years of buried feeling clawing back up through my ribs, and I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I was not going to let her disappear again without a fight. I told myself I only wanted to help her. That the late-night phone calls, the coffee that turned into dinner that turned into hours spent parked outside her mother's house so she wouldn't have to walk in alone after a bad appointment. That all of it was friendship, nothing more. A debt of my own I was finally repaying for 8 years of silence I hadn't chosen but had let define me anyway. I was lying to myself again. I was getting good at it. "You don't have to keep doing this," she told me one night in October, sitting on the hood of my car outside the hospital where her mother was finishing a round of treatment. The city lights smeared gold across the wet pavement. She had a habit, I'd relearned, of tucking her knees to her chest when she was trying to make herself smaller than her problems. "Showing up. Being here. I don't deserve it." "You've never once asked me to be here," I said. "I keep coming back because I want to." "That's the problem, Ethan." Her voice was barely more than breath. "You keep coming back." We didn't talk about what that meant. We didn't have to. It sat between us in the front seat of my car every night I drove her home, in the 2 inches of space we never quite closed, in the way her hand would find mine on the console and then pull back like she'd touched something that could burn her. Julian noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like Julian noticed everything that threatened what they considered theirs. He started showing up wherever Maya and I were. Casually, he'd say, "I was in the neighborhood, darling." But there was nothing casual about the way his eyes tracked the space between us, measuring it, resenting it. He brought her flowers she didn't ask for and rings she didn't wear and a wedding planner who called her 4 times a day with decisions she had no energy left to make. He was, I began to understand, a man building a cage out of gestures so generous no one would ever call it a cage. He's not a bad person, Maya told me once, defensive in a way that made me wonder who she was really trying to convince. He's used to getting what he wants. And what he wants is you. What he wants, she said carefully, is complicated. It has nothing to do with love, Ethan, and everything to do with things I can't explain yet. Yet, I held on to that word like a lifeline. The night everything changed, we weren't even trying for it to happen. Her mother had taken a bad turn. Nothing fatal, the doctors said, but frightening enough that Maya had sat in a hospital hallway for 6 hours convinced she was about to lose the only parent she had left. I found her there at midnight, folded into a plastic chair, mascara long gone, looking like the 11-year-old girl who used to cry into my shoulder when her parents fought too loud for her to sleep through. I didn't say anything. I just sat down and let her lean into me, the way she used to, like no time had passed at all, like 8 years and an engagement ring and a debt neither of us had chosen hadn't built a wall between us brick by brick. "I'm so tired, Ethan," she whispered into my shoulder. "I'm so tired of being the person who has to be strong for everyone. I don't know how to just fall apart. Not even once. Not even for a minute." "Fall apart," I said. "I'll catch you. I've been catching you since we were kids. I'm not going to stop now." She lifted her head, and her face was so close to mine that I could count the tears still clinging to her lashes. And for one suspended, dangerous second, neither of us moved. Her breath caught. Mine did too. I felt 8 years of restraint crack straight down the middle. "Ethan." My name, again but different this time. A warning and an invitation both. "If you kiss me right now, I don't think I'll be able to stop." "Then don't stop," I said, and closed the distance myself, because I had spent 8 years being careful with her heart and I was done being careful. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined for 2 decades and somehow more than every version I'd ever let myself dream. It was desperate and slow at once, her hands fisting in my shirt like she was afraid I'd disappear, mine cradling her jaw like she was something I'd waited my whole life to be allowed to touch. When we finally broke apart, she was crying again, but it was a different kind of crying, the kind that comes from finally putting down something you've been carrying too long. "This can't happen," she said, even as her forehead stayed pressed to mine.
"I'm engaged, Ethan."
"There are people counting on this marriage. My mother's medical bills. You don't understand what happens if I walk away." "Then help me understand. Let me help you carry it." "You can't." Her voice broke on the word. "You especially can't, Ethan, and that's the part one can never tell you." She wouldn't explain what she meant. She kissed me once more, hard and hopeless, like a goodbye disguised as a beginning, and then she pulled away and asked me to take her home, and neither of us said another word the entire drive. Julian found out 3 days later. I don't know how, a photograph, a rumor, a member of the wedding staff with loose lips and a loyalty to whoever paid better. But he showed up at my office with a folder in his hand and a smile that had gone cold as steel. "I think it's time you and I had a conversation, Mr. Cole," he said, dropping the folder onto my desk. "About your father's company, about the loan that saved it 15 years ago, and about exactly whose signature is on the paperwork that makes all of this," he gestured between us, vague and vicious, so much more complicated than a schoolyard crush. I opened the folder with hands that had gone very still, and the ground I thought I was standing on quietly, catastrophically, gave way. My father's company, the one I had inherited, rebuilt, and spent a decade being proud of, had been saved from bankruptcy 15 years ago by a loan from Robert Whitfield, Maya's father. A loan that had, through a chain of paperwork I was only now seeing for the first time, ultimately been financed by Ashford Capital. Julian's family. "You've been building your empire," Julian said quietly, "on my family's money, which means everything you have, your name, your reputation, the roof over your head, exists because we allowed it to. Maya knows this. Maya has known this for years. It's why she came to me in the first place, Mr. Cole. Not because she loves me. Because she understood, the way you apparently never bothered to, that some debts follow you no matter how far you run. I didn't sleep again that night either. I sat with that folder open on my desk and understood. Finally, the fear I'd seen in Maya's eyes at her father's grave. She hadn't been protecting a secret about her family. She'd been protecting me from one. Carrying the weight of a debt I didn't even know I owed, so that I could keep believing I'd built my life on nothing but my own two hands. She had been sacrificing herself for me, and I hadn't even noticed I was the one being saved. I went to her apartment that night and she wouldn't open the door. "Maya, I know," I said through the wood, my forehead pressed against it like I could somehow reach her through 6 inches of oak. "I know about the loan. I know what your father did for my father, and I know what it cost your family, and I know Julian's been using it to keep you exactly where he wants you. Let me in, please." "There's nothing to say, Ethan." Her voice was thick with tears on the other side. "It doesn't change anything. I still have to marry him. It changes everything. It means you never owed me your silence. It means you gave up 8 years of your life to protect a debt that was never yours to carry alone." The door didn't open. I stood in that hallway until the building's night security politely asked me to leave, and I went home and did the only thing I knew how to do when the ground disappeared beneath me. I started digging. It took me 2 weeks and every favor I had left to call in, but I found what Julian had been so careful to bury. The loan that had saved my father's company hadn't been a gift from the Whitfield family out of old friendship, the way I'd always assumed the small original amount was. It had been restructured years later, quietly at predatory terms by Ashford Capital, specifically so that if it were ever called in, it would bankrupt not just Robert Whitfield's failing business but mine as well. Julian's father had engineered it as insurance, a leash disguised as generosity, in case his son ever needed leverage to secure a marriage his family considered strategically valuable. Maya wasn't marrying Julian to save her mother's medical bills alone. She was marrying him because if she didn't, both her family and mine would lose everything. My company, my father's legacy, the life I'd spent a decade building with my own 2 hands would collapse overnight, and she had decided, alone, in silence, that my ignorance was worth more than her happiness. I confronted her with it 3 days before the wedding, at the rehearsal dinner, in a ballroom dripping with white orchids and old money, and I have never in my life done anything as reckless or as necessary. "You knew," I said, pulling her into the hallway outside the ballroom, away from 200 guests who had no idea their evening was about to detonate. "You knew this whole time that you were protecting my company, my father's name. You let me believe you were choosing Julian over me because you didn't love me enough, when the truth is you loved me too much to let me lose everything." Her composure, the careful glass mask she'd worn since her father's funeral, finally shattered. "What was I supposed to do, Ethan? Watch you lose the one thing you built out of the wreckage your father left behind? Watch your name get dragged through bankruptcy court because I couldn't bring myself to marry a man I don't love? I made a choice. I chose to protect you the only way I knew how. You should have let me choose too. Would you have let me marry him if I told you the truth?" Her eyes blazed through the tears. "Would you have stood back and let me sacrifice myself for your company if I'd asked you to?" "No," I admitted. "Never. That's why I couldn't tell you." Her voice broke completely. "Because I know you, Ethan Cole. I've known you since we were children, and I know that the second I told you the truth, you would have burned your entire life down trying to save me from a choice that was never yours to make. I couldn't let you do that. I would rather lose you than watch you lose everything because of me. Julian found us like that. Inches apart, breathless, the truth finally spilled across the marble floor between us, and something in his carefully polished composure finally cracked. "You told him," he said to Maya, low and dangerous. "After everything you told him. He deserved to know the truth, Julian. He deserved—" Julian laughed, sharp and humorless. "What he deserves is irrelevant. This marriage happens in 3 days whether he knows the truth or not, Maya. My father will call in that loan the moment you humiliate this family, and Cole and Associates will not survive the quarter. Is that what you want, Ethan? For your father's name to end in bankruptcy court, because you couldn't keep your hands off another man's fiancée? I'll take that risk," I said, and I meant it with every fractured piece of myself. "I would rather lose the company my father built than watch you force the woman I love into a marriage built on blackmail." "How noble!" Julian's smile turned cruel. "Except it isn't your risk to take alone, is it? There are 40 employees at your firm. There's your father's legacy. There's Maya's mother, whose medical care my family has been quietly subsidizing for the past year." "Did she mention that part?" "No, I didn't think so." He turned to Maya, and for the first time I saw something almost like desperation beneath his cruelty. "I never wanted to be the villain in this, Maya. I wanted you to choose me. I built an entire life around the hope that if I gave you enough, did enough, you'd eventually stop looking at me like I was a debt you were paying off instead of a man who—" He stopped himself, jaw tight, and I understood, with an unexpected pang of something like pity, that Julian Ashford had spent years trying to buy a love he was never going to be able to purchase, and some broken part of him had known that all along. "I'm sorry, Julian," Maya said quietly. "I never meant to hurt you. But I can't marry you. Not for my mother's care. Not for Ethan's company. Not for anyone's protection but my own heart, which has belonged to someone else since I was 11 years old and too young to even understand what that meant." "Then walk away," Julian said, voice gone cold and final. "Walk away right now, and watch what happens to everyone you claim to be protecting. The loan gets called in tomorrow morning. Your mother's care ends the moment the wedding does. And Ethan's company—" He looked at me with something almost like satisfaction. "Ethan's company folds within the month. That's the price of your heart, Maya. I hope he's worth it." He walked back into the ballroom, and the doors swung shut behind him like the closing of a courtroom verdict, and Maya and I stood in that marble hallway staring at the wreckage of every choice that had brought us here. And for the first time since I'd seen her at her father's grave, I watched her stop fighting. "Maybe he's right," she whispered. "Maybe some debts really can't be forgiven. Maybe loving you was never going to be enough to save either of us." "Don't," I said, gripping her hands like I could physically hold her to the decision. "Don't you dare give up now." "I'm not giving up, Ethan." Her eyes were dry now, terrifyingly calm. The calm of a woman who had already made a decision she hated. "I'm being realistic. I have to think about my mother. I have to think about your father's legacy, about 40 families who depend on your company for their livelihood. I can't let my own happiness destroy that many lives. Then let me fight for it. Give me 48 hours. Let me find a way out of this that doesn't require you to disappear into a marriage that's really just a beautifully decorated prison." She looked at me for a long moment, grief and hope warring openly across her face for the first time since I'd found her again, and finally, quietly, she nodded. 48 hours, she said. "And then I marry him, Ethan, whether you find a way out or not. Because I would rather live without you than watch everyone we love pay for a happiness that was never mine to take." I left that ballroom with a deadline, a devastated heart, and absolutely no idea how I was going to save either of us. But I had spent my entire career building things that weren't supposed to be possible. Bridges across impassable rivers, towers on unstable ground, and I was not going to let this be the one structure I couldn't save. I spent the next 48 hours awake, on the phone, in law offices and bank lobbies in my father's old study, pulling apart 15 years of paperwork thread by thread until I found the loose one Julian's family had never expected anyone to look for. The restructured loan wasn't just predatory. It was illegal, a violation of lending regulations so specific and so quietly buried that it had taken a retired banking attorney, an old friend of my father's, exactly 6 hours to confirm what I'd suspected. Ashford Capital had manipulated the original terms of Robert Whitfield's loan without proper disclosure, using it as leverage rather than legitimate business, which meant the debt hanging over both our families wasn't just cruel. It was unenforceable. If we were willing to fight it in court and drag Julian's family name through the exact kind of scandal they'd spent a generation avoiding. They'll settle. The attorney told me at 2 in the morning, exhaustion and adrenaline making the words feel unreal. The second we file, they'll settle. Men like Julian's father don't survive public scrutiny. But Ethan, you need to understand what filing this actually means. It's not just a legal case. It's a declaration of war on the family your father spent 30 years trying to stay in business with. There's no undoing this once it starts. Good, I said, because I'm done being the man who let other people decide what I was allowed to lose. I filed the papers at 9 the next morning. By noon, my phone was ringing with calls from Ashford Capital's lawyers, panicked and furious in equal measure. By 2, Julian's father was threatening a countersuit that legally didn't have a leg to stand on, and both of us knew it. By 4, word had reached Julian himself, and by 6, he was standing in my office doorway looking like a man watching his entire carefully constructed life come apart in real time. You had no right, he said, voice shaking with something that wasn't quite anger. Do you understand what you've done? My father built that leverage over a decade. You just handed him a scandal that will follow this family for a generation. I understand exactly what I've done, I said. I've made sure Maya never has to marry a man to save people she loves from a debt that was never legal in the first place. If your family wants to blame someone, blame the men who structured a fraudulent loan instead of the woman who spent 8 years being punished for it. Julian stood in that doorway for a long moment, and something in his face finally, completely broke. Not rage, but grief. The particular grief of a man realizing he had built his entire courtship on a foundation that was never going to hold. I really did love her, he said quietly. Somewhere in all of this, underneath the leverage and my father's schemes, I actually fell in love with her. I don't expect you to believe that. I believe it, I said, and I meant it, because I understood better than anyone how loving Maya Whitfield could make a person capable of things they never thought themselves capable of, both terrible and extraordinary. But love built on someone else's debt was never going to survive, Julian. Not for you. Not for anyone. He left without another word, and 3 hours later, I heard the wedding had been canceled. I found Maya at the treehouse. It shouldn't have surprised me. Of course she'd go back there, to the one place that had belonged to both of us before the world got complicated, before debts and marriages and blackmail folders. The old wooden platform was smaller than I remembered, sagging slightly with age, but it was still standing, the way I liked to think we both were, battered but upright, still holding on. She was sitting on the edge with her feet dangling into open air, exactly the way she used to when we were 14, and the whole world felt like something that could wait outside the branches of that oak tree. I heard what you did, she said without turning around. The lawsuit, the scandal you started to save my mother's care and stop Julian's father in his tracks. Everyone's talking about it. Do you have any idea what you risked? Everything, I said, climbing up to sit beside her. I risked everything, Maya, because I finally understood that the alternative was watching you disappear into a life you never chose. And I would rather lose my father's company 100 times over than lose you once. She finally turned to look at me, eyes red-rimmed but clear. No more masks, no more careful performances. At my father's grave, she said, I told you there was a lot you didn't know. Do you remember what I couldn't say to you then? That you were being forced into a marriage to protect 2 families from a debt neither of us understood. That too. A small, broken smile. But mostly, Ethan, mostly I couldn't say that I never stopped loving you. Not for one single day of those 8 years. I left because I thought I was protecting you from a mess my father's failing business had created. I stayed away because every time I thought about coming home, I was terrified that seeing you again would make it impossible to do what I thought I had to do to save my mother. And I said yes to Julian because some broken, exhausted part of me had convinced myself that if I couldn't have the love I actually wanted, at least I could use whatever was left of my heart to protect the people I loved most. Maya, let me finish. Her hand found mine on the weathered wood between us, the same way it had 100 times when we were young enough not to know what that touch would eventually cost us. At the rehearsal dinner before Julian found us, I almost told you to walk away. I almost let you go, because some part of me still believed I didn't deserve to be chosen over an entire company, an entire family's legacy. And then you filed that lawsuit anyway, without asking my permission, without waiting for me to give you the green light, because you'd already decided I was worth the risk before I ever worked up the courage to believe it myself. You've always been worth the risk, I said, my voice breaking on the words. You were worth it when we were kids sneaking out to watch meteor showers. You were worth it the night you fell out of that treehouse and made me swear not to tell your father. You were worth it standing in that church doorway with your fiancé's hand on your back. And you were worth it every single day of 8 years I spent pretending I'd moved on. I have never once, in my entire life, loved anyone the way I love you, Maya Whitfield, and I am done letting debts and duty and fear decide what we're allowed to have. Her eyes filled, and this time when she looked at me, there was nothing guarded left in her expression at all. Just 20 years of history and heartbreak and a hope so raw it made my chest ache to witness it. At the church, she whispered, when I mouthed those words to you, I meant them more than I've ever meant anything. I need you to understand what I'm about to ask you, Ethan, because I need you to actually answer it this time, out loud, where I can hear you. Ask me anything. She took my face in both hands, the way she used to when we were children, and she wanted to make sure I was really listening, and looked straight into my eyes with a fierceness that undid every last defense I had left. If you loved me, she said, voice trembling but sure, you'd stop me from leaving. So stop me, Ethan. Stop me from ever walking away from you again. Because I don't want to spend one more day of my life pretending I can survive without you. And I am so tired of being brave enough to let you go. I didn't answer her with words. I answered her the way I should have 8 years ago, the way I'd been trying to since the moment I saw her standing at her father's grave. I kissed her like the promise it was always meant to be, slow and certain and unafraid, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask permission because it already knows the answer. When we finally broke apart, both of us laughing through tears in the fading light, she rested her forehead against mine the way she had that night in the hospital hallway, and whispered the only words either of us had left. Don't let me go, Ethan Cole. Never again, I promised. Not for a debt, not for a company, not for anyone's idea of what we're supposed to sacrifice. You're not a debt to be settled, Maya. You never were. You're the only home I've ever actually wanted to build. We got married the following spring, in the backyard beneath that same battered old oak tree, with a treehouse still nailed lopsided in its branches and 40 employees from my father's company standing as witnesses to a debt that had finally, truly been paid. Not with money, but with the truth, and with a love that had survived 8 years of silence, a fraudulent inheritance, a jealous rival, and a courtroom battle neither of us ever expected to fight. Maya's mother sat in the front row in remission, healthy enough to cry through the entire ceremony. Julian sent a card, no note, just his name, which was as close to peace as either of us was ever going to get from him, and more than either of us expected. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to this union, the only sound in that garden was the wind moving through the branches of a treehouse that had somehow, impossibly, held both of us up since we were children too young to know what forever meant. Maya looked at me the way she had on that oak branch. No glass between us anymore. Nothing guarded left to protect. If you loved me, she whispered, just for me, an old wound turned into a vow. You'd never let me leave again. Never, I said. Not for anything in this world. And for the first time in 8 years, neither one of us was lying.